Welcome to the Power Factor Show.
The bandwidth for this episode of the Power Factor Show is brought to you by the Firearms Radio Network, firearmsradio.tv.
Sponsored by Taylor Freelance, Rainier Ballistics, Hodgdon Powders, and JPL Precision.
Hey Power Factor fans, I'm Rick, and we've done some episodes about hand loading. I'm a big fan of referring to doing this as hand loading. Since doing this is reloading, we're going to talk about hand loading. And one of the things that we didn't talk about in previous episodes is loading near maximum loads for a given cartridge for a given application. Now in USPSA and IDPA competition, in general, in order to make power factor, especially if you have a 5-inch barrel, which for most automatic pistols is the longest barrel, you'll actually have to load down, or you're allowed to load down to make power factor. So for instance, I use, when I'm shooting in CDP or single stack, I'm shooting a 45 auto, and full power 200 grain loads would be running at about 950, if you go plus P, maybe even close to 1,000 feet per second. But for competition, you're loading down to about 850 feet per second with a 200 grain bullet. But even though the velocity is not near max for that bullet weight, depending on your powder charge and your powder burn rate, you may be very near the maximum for that cartridge. Now, as an example, Steve and I have discussed how we're big fans of Hodgdon Clay's powder when we're loading for our 45 auto major power loads. And if I'm shooting a 200 grain bullet out of a 5-inch gun, I need to load 4.2, even 4.3 grains, depending on my bullet, whether I'm using a black bullet, plated bullet, jacketed bullet. And 4.3 grains is the recommended maximum load for Hodgdon Clays with a 200 grain bullet. So even though 850 feet per second is nowhere near what we would consider to be a maximum load in terms of velocity, depending on your powder burn rate, it could be a maximum charge. The maximum chamber pressure for 45 auto is about 20,000 psi. And there are plenty of loads around, especially with fast burning powders, where your velocities are going to be around 800, 850 feet per second, but you're right at the pressure max. And so there are certain things you want to look for, pressure signs, when you're hand loading, to see if your rounds are nearing that max or if you're a little bit over max. Now typically, a lot of the times you'll hear people talk about things like flattened primers. Well, I'm not seeing flattened primers, and that can be an indicator that your pressure curve is near the max. You're getting towards max pressure. As the case is pushed back against the breech face, the rounded edges of the primer get pushed out flat against the breech face, and you'll often even see little indentations or marks on the primer itself that are impressed into the primer by the breech face. If you've got, you know, little machining marks or something in the breech face, you'll see those imprinted on the primer. And that's an indication that the primer is being pushed back against the breech face, but by itself it's not necessarily an indication, because, for instance, I'm shooting my 4.2 grains of clays with a 200 grain Bear Creek bullet, and that is near max pressure, but it's a perfectly safe load. And so if I were seeing slightly flattened primers, I would think I should expect that because it's near a max load in terms of pressure. Now there are other things you can look for. If you've got especially a case that the case of having a non-ramped barrel that exposes a little more of the brass case in the like 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock region on the chambered round, you can get a little bit of a bulge there. And I've seen some rounds where you get a lot of a bulge there, but you can measure the case with a caliper right forward of the extractor groove and measure the diameter of the case in exactly that point where it hangs over the feed ramp. And as you start to see more expansion, that's another pressure indicator. If you see a couple thousandths, that's not a big deal. But if you start seeing more thousandths of expansion, especially to the point if you hold the case up to the light and you can actually see a physical bulge in the case, that's another pressure sign, something to be aware of. Now, I have not done much hand loading at the maximum levels, again, because almost all the shooting I do is for competition. With 45 auto, I'm generally loading down. But I've started hand loading just kind of as like an exercise, not really with any purpose in mind, no end result in mind. But I've started hand loading 45 Super. And 45 Super is kind of an obscure cartridge. It's not really well known. It's a way of getting improved ballistics from a pistol chambered in 45 auto. The 45 Super cartridge goes back, I want to say 15 or 20 years, experiments with heavier strengthened cases. There's a round called 4508, which is 308 or 30-06, cut down to 45 auto dimensions. There was an older cartridge called 451 Detonics, which was a higher pressure case that was lengthened so that it would not fit in a standard 45 auto chamber. And you lose, you lose some of that interchangeability by extending the length of the case, which requires rechambering the barrel. You don't have the problem then of mixing up these high pressure cartridges with standard pressure 45 auto. So you can kind of choose your poison. Do you want to go for the ultimate interchangeability with 45 Super, which will fit in a standard 45 auto chamber, or do you want to not risk getting those highly loaded rounds into a standard 45 auto pistol and go with something like 460 Roland or 451 Detonics? I didn't want to mess with rechambering, so I decided to use 45 Super for my experiment. And what 45 Super is a case that looks externally identical to 45 auto, same length, same rim diameter, but it's been strengthened to withstand almost 50% higher pressure. The standard pressure for 45 auto is about 20,000 psi. The highest pressure for 45 Super is 28,000 psi, which is not high pressure. That 28,000 psi is less than max chamber pressure for 9mm or 40 Smith & Wesson or 10mm, so it's not really high pressure. But relative to the cartridge that it's based on, 45 auto, it's almost a 50% increase. And the ballistics that you can get are pretty impressive. A standard 5-inch 45 auto with a 200 grain bullet, you might be able to get up to 1,000 feet per second if you load it pretty hot. With 45 Super, we're talking maybe 1,200 feet per second. With a 6-inch gun like this one, maybe more than that, a little bit more than that. And I chose this gun specifically for the experiment precisely because it has the 6-inch barrel. This is my old limited 10 gun. I've shown it on the show before. It's a Caspian frame and slide with a 6-inch bull barrel from Storm Lake. There's STI bits on the inside and outside, and it's just been a really good gun. I mean, I shot this in limited 10 almost every weekend for, boy, I want to say 8 years. And it was a great gun that I used when I was shooting limited 10, but it just hasn't seen much use for a few years. So I thought it would be the perfect gun for my 45 Super experiment because it's got a long bull barrel. I can get a little more velocity than I would from a 5-inch gun. And also because of the higher pressure, there's things that you want to do to try to resist the higher pressure. I've heard people post things on forums saying, oh, just take your standard 45 and throw a 32-pound recoil spring in there, and that's your 45 Super conversion. And while a heavier recoil spring is part of the deal, I think it's actually the least important part. You are going to have to go to a heavier recoil spring, but I think there are other modifications that you can make. Now, when you're trying to resist the additional pressure, resisting that extra pressure can be done with weight, which is the function of a heavy bull 6-inch barrel. You can get the extra weight of the barrel resists unlocking. You've got the long slide that resists unlocking. In this case, it's got some perforations in it here that lighten it actually, which was a competition touch. But this slide is, I think, at least, even with the lightening features, is at least as heavy as a 5-inch slide, and the 6-inch bull probably makes up. So if you're talking about total weight, reciprocating weight that's resisting unlocking, it's probably considerably more weights than a normal 5-inch bushing barrel. Now, other things that I have done to this gun that I consider more important than just the heavy recoil spring are a heavy mainspring. A lot of people run lighter mainsprings in their competition guns, 15, 17, 19. I've got a 25-pound mainspring in this gun, and again, what that's for is, of course, the slide has to overrun the hammer to recock the mechanism. So the heavier the mainspring, the harder it is for the slide to overcome the mainspring pressure. So I've got a heavier mainspring in there, again, to resist the unlocking of the higher pressure cartridge. Another thing we have is a square firing pin stop. I don't know if you can clearly see that. The heel of the firing pin stop is just barely broken and just almost has like a bevel on it, whereas a typical firing pin stop would have a considerable radius on there to essentially assist unlocking. But what we're trying to do is resist unlocking. So by using the square firing pin stop, we've moved the pivot point on the hammer from just below the firing pin almost all the way down to its pivot point. So the combination of the square firing pin stop and the heavy mainspring, plus a slightly heavier recoil spring, I think I've got a 22-pounder in here, the combination of all those things means that it's going to be considerably more difficult to cock the hammer, rack the slide, and because we've only gone to a 22-pound mainspring, which is similar to what you'd see in a 10mm, it's not radically heavier than a 45, and so you don't mess up the feed cycle. When you go to a really stiff recoil spring, you mess up the timing because the slide comes back slower, it slams shut faster. The dwell time that the magazine is uncovered is different than it is with a 45 auto because you've used that radically heavier recoil spring. So I like making these mods to the mainspring, firing pin stop, that don't require that you use a really heavy recoil spring in order to get the same kind of overall cycling rate. You slow down the slide by using the heavier mainspring and the firing pin stop, but then you don't have to use a heavy spring to resist that, and so your feed cycle is a lot more reliable. And so that's the modifications, those are the modifications that I've done to this gun. And of course, the whole point of the exercise is increased velocity. So I'm doing heavy loads, and I started to look for what are those signs that I'm going to see. And we've covered the things that are kind of inspecting the case. You can look for flattened primers. You can look for cratered primers. If you've got the firing pin hole that's in the breech face does not fit tightly around the firing pin, you can sometimes get the primer cup will flow back into the firing pin hole, and it can actually cause malfunctions. It can cause issues as that metal gets back inside the firing pin hole. It can prevent clean unlocking. You can also get firing pin drag if the gun's unlocking too quickly. You can recognize that by a little elongation of the impact on the firing pin. So there's just little things to look for in that respect. But of course, what you can also look for is if you're used to shooting a certain, say, major power factor load, is how does it feel? Is it recoiling a lot? I mean, do you feel like the recoil is really sharp? If it feels hot, it probably is hot. And likewise, ejection is going to be the same way. Normally, my major power factor loads with a 14-pound recoil spring, I'm seeing them eject maybe 4, 5, 6 feet out of the gun. And with this, when I was shooting what turned out to be about plus P level loads, I'll go into it a little bit, but even what was a recommended near max load of 45 Super, I was really only getting about plus P velocities, and those cases were still ejecting about 5 feet. They were landing in my range bag. So what I was concerned with is building up to my max load. I found some recommended load data. I have a selection of powders, and I thought, what powders do I have that are appropriate? And I'd had some success using Ramshot Enforcer, which is a slow burning powder. If you looked at the powder burn rate episode, it's way at the very slow end of what most people are going to use for handgun cartridges, and I've had some success using it in 10 millimeter, so I thought, okay, I've got some load data for Enforcer, I've got some Enforcer powder, let's try that. And the recommended max was 13.5 grains, and from a 5-inch barrel, according to my load data, I was supposed to get just over 1,000 feet per second. So I'm thinking, yeah, from a 6-inch barrel, maybe 1,015, 1,020, something like that. So I went to the range with a buddy. He set up his chrono before I got there, and so I'm loading the gun up, and I'm going, okay, stand back now. You know, I'm going to fire these 45 super, you know, and we're about 15 feet away from the side berm, and I told him, hey, keep an eye out for those cases and make sure they're not ejecting all the way over the berm. I want to make sure we get them back. You know, and I'm getting myself all ready, and I fire the first round. I think I'd done 2/10 grain steps. So my max load was 13.5, so I'd done 13.3, 13.1, 12.9, 12.7, and 12.5. So I fired my first round at 12.5, you know, dribbles out like this, and the velocity is like 870 feet per second. And I'm thinking, this is 45 super, 870 feet per second. So I go up to 12.7, 12.9, 13.1, 13.3, and I'm still only at about 970 feet per second. And I'm thinking, this is not what I expected at all. I mean, I was expecting shock and awe, you know, 4-digit velocities, and it was really disappointing. And I did some other research, and some people were saying Enforcer really needs a higher pressure in order to perform well. So that would be an indication of why it works in 10 millimeter, which has about a 35,000 PSI limit, and why it didn't really work so well in 45 Super, because it's only a 28,000 PSI limit. But still, looking at the cases, I could see a little tail on the firing pin strikes, which is an indication of early unlocking. That means the firing pin is still protruding from the breech face as the barrel starts to drop out of battery. And I put a new extra power firing pin spring in there right before I shot the gun. So that was kind of a concern, because I expected that would not be an issue, that the firing pin spring and the heavier the modifications that I'd done to the mainspring and the firing pin stop, that I wouldn't have an issue with that. But that was a little bit interesting, because I just thought, you know, I'm not really seeing very high velocities, so I don't think I'm having issues with premature unlocking, but my load was near max. 13.5 is near max, so I didn't want to just disregard one of these indicators that something is wrong, seeing this elongated firing pin strike. So I'm going to look into that a little bit more, and it's just one of those things that you should be aware of. But I'd say, just from somebody who's really familiar with your loads, if you feel that it's hot, you know, you feel extra recoil, and you're seeing the cases ejecting 10 feet, 15 feet, you know it's a hot load. I mean, nobody needs to tell you that if it just appears to be hot. But just be aware of the signs, the flattened primer, crater primer, case bulges. Be aware of all of that, and keep all of that in mind when you're doing your loading. As you get near max, just be aware of those pressure signs, and if you start seeing them, look for a reason. You know, don't go. I didn't fire the 13.5 grain loads, which were the max. I decided to just stop at 13.3, kind of reevaluate, see what the issues were. Why was I seeing that elongated firing pin mark, even though my velocities weren't really very good? So I'm going to start over again with AA number 7 or power pistol powder or something, and try to build it back up to 1,000 feet per second. But in all of your hand loading, just be really wary of those pressure signs and pay attention to them.
Hey Power Factor fans, I'm Larry, and I'm here with your weekly trivia question, and here it is. So let's say you're in a USPSA match, you're the range officer, next shooter comes up to the line, you give him the make ready command, and he takes the gun out of the holster and loads a magazine, and when he racks the slide, you see an orange plastic dummy round come out of the chamber. What is your call, and what's the rule number? Email us your answer to powerfactorshow@gmail.com. Be sure to visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/powerfactorshow, and our website, powerfactorshow.com. We are now answering our trivia questions on Facebook, so look for that. And thanks for watching. See you next week.